Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we're taking a deep look at the outcome of the COP28 climate summit, which concluded at the very end of 2023. We spoke with Georgetown professor Joanna Lewis for a detailed look into this issue. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Good morning, Freddie. How's it going?
Good, thanks, Kelly. How are you?
Oh, not too bad. This is our first episode in 2024. How was your break? I know you got back to the UK.
Yeah, amazing time. Nice being back with my family. Only a couple of weeks. England's not the best place to be in for the midwinter, but you know what? It's nice being back home for a bit. How about you?
Yeah, it was good. We were in town, had family come to us, and I got little kids, so they loved everything about the holiday season. And we actually got some snow in DC, so they got to do some sled riding recently. So
So
it's been good. Yeah. So. Yeah, that's right. You were asking to borrow my sleds.
I did. I know. Sadly, you're
But
away.
that's okay. Anyways, what's on the docket today?
So today we are going to get into the Taiwan election results. We're going to get into an update on the situation in Congress with regards to Ukraine and Israel funding. And we are going to be talking about the deal between Ethiopia and Somaliland. So let's jump right into the Taiwan election results. The biggest story in the Indo-Pacific right now is the results of Taiwan's recent presidential election. On January 13th, Li Ching-te of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party won with just over 40% of the vote, trouncing the other two relatively pro-China candidates. International commentators are saying that the result is a rejection by the Taiwanese people of threats from mainland China, which has had a tense relationship with the ruling party. There are some questions about the DPP's ability to govern effectively, as they do not have an overall majority in parliament, but it is clear that the election of Lai will complicate the already very fraught cross-strait relations. So, Kelly, what do these results mean? Why did the Taiwanese people vote this way? And what could the election of Lai portend for the future of the island in regards to China?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the party of the incumbent president, that's the Democratic Progressive Party, and we'll just call them the DPP from here on out, they won this election with about 40% of the vote. And the outgoing president is Tsai Ing-wen. And over the course of the last couple of years, she's moved Taiwanese foreign policy a bit more towards a pro-Western stance. And she was in office, or has been in office, since 2016. And if you think back over the last couple of years, some of these things stand out. There was obviously the Nancy Pelosi visit back in fall of 2022. And that led to a lot of issues with China that we dealt with last year, with the worsening of relations and the spy balloon and the ending of the military to military calls and all that kind of stuff. The Taiwanese have also been buying more American arms. And then Tsai herself actually came to the US, and Speaker McCarthy at the time visited her out in California. So the new president-elect takes office in May. He's currently the vice president of Taiwan, and he's got a history of strong pro-independence sentiment. So it's unlikely that this is going to change that much as far as their direction that they're going on independence and pro-Western stance. It'll be interesting to see how they rule in Taiwan, though, because they didn't win a legislative majority. They actually lost their legislative majority. So that's going to be an issue, especially because of the fact that, like here in the United States, foreign policy isn't really a major issue in elections. Now, Taiwan, it's a little bit different because you have a country to the north that's saying that it's going to take you over. So it's a little bit different than here in the United States. But people at the end of the day are really interested in bread and butter issues. And that's no different in Taiwan. So they're not really focused on the China problem as much as maybe we are in the West, and really want the new president to try to shore things up domestically and with the economy and different things like that. So we'll see how they're able to govern. The big thing from a foreign policy standpoint is going to be, how does China react? And they're not thrilled with this, as you can imagine, because it's a pro-independence party that's going to maintain power. And it's likely, I haven't seen a ton of stuff. There's been some stuff in the news lately about a lot of balloons being flown around Taiwan by the Chinese. time will tell here, but I think we could see Xi exert more pressure in the coming months as the new president officially takes office in May, but something definitely to keep an eye on.
So, our next big story is an update on the situation in the United States Congress towards funding Ukraine. So, time might be running out for Congress to get its act together and pass an aid package to send a fresh tranche of direly needed military aid to Ukraine. Since the Biden administration's $110 billion request for Ukraine and Israel aid was voted down shortly before the holidays, House Republicans and Senate conservatives have drawn a line in the sand, and they've said no more money for the US's allies until a deal is reached stemming the flow of persons over the United States southern border. Republican frontrunner Donald Trump has lambasted the deal and encouraged Republicans in Congress to sink it. Several Senate Republicans have gone after Trump, accusing him of grandstanding in an election year to the detriment of national security, both at the border and across the world, by tying these two bills together and then politically killing the border aspect of the bill. So, Kelly, let's start with the basics. How important is it that more funding is passed to help Ukraine, and what's been the holdup so far?
I mean, it's utterly important that we get this money for Ukraine. The Pentagon is basically out of money for Ukraine to send them more arms and goods, and they desperately need that, especially as they start running low on munitions. So a week ago, just to put it into stark terms here, Secretary of Defense Austin chaired another meeting of the 50-member international forum that was designed to coordinate aid to Ukraine. And for the first time since the war started, Secretary Austin had actually nothing to offer at the meeting. So that kind of shows you where we are with financial aid and military aid to Ukraine right now. And, it's a presidential election. We are officially into 2024, and that's going to cause a lot of difficulties in Congress because not that things aren't always political, but they're going to become much more political with an eye towards the general election in November. And we've already seen that. Former President Trump does not want President Biden to get a win, but especially a win on something like the border, where Democrats have been, and President Biden in particular, have been polling very poorly, and something that former President Trump sees as an edge that he can use, about him being much tougher and stronger on the border than President Biden is. So we're kind of stuck because, as you noted, they've linked the aid to Ukraine with reform on the border. And and it doesn't look at this point, and who knows what will happen, but it doesn't look like at this point that we're going to see much movement on the border stuff now that President Trump has weighed in against that. So we will see.
So it looks like the border deal is dead, and so Congress won't move on the rest of the money anytime, especially soon. If that's the case, then can the US's allies step up? What happens to Europe in this time? Are they able to fill that gap that the US is currently leaving empty?
So, in short, no. They've done some things. Last week, there was a deal announced, a NATO deal for I think 1.2 billion for Ukraine, and there's a few extra billion coming out of France, some money from the Netherlands and other countries. But you got to put this in perspective. There's roughly $60 billion for Ukraine that Congress has not moved on, and that just dwarfs all these other numbers. So this is specifically goes towards things like 155 millimeter ammunition for artillery, high mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS. So these are things that they're using at rapid rates. And they need to keep doing that if they want to maintain what they're doing in the war and not succumb to Russia's offensive or counteroffensives or bombardment. So Europe at this point just doesn't really have the financial means or the industrial capacity to do what the United States is capable of doing, or to keep up with the Russians and what they're able to do. So it really, the bulk of this really does need to come from the United States.
Certainly, we recently saw that, I think it was today or yesterday, the IMF's growth forecast for Russia actually increased for next year because of the fact that their war economy is actually, at the very least, increasing their industrial output, which is something that Europe hasn't been able to do. So certainly something we need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, interesting.
So moving swiftly on to our third story today, we are talking about the Ethiopia and Somaliland deal. There have been a lot of diplomatic rumblings in the Horn of Africa lately. Somaliland, a breakaway region of Somalia that has democratically governed itself since 1991, struck a deal this month with landlocked Ethiopia to allow the latter access to the Red Sea. Neighboring Somalia, in a tit-for-tat move, strengthened ties with Eritrea, which borders Ethiopia and has had tense relations with it since it seceded from Ethiopian rule in the 1990s. Somalia has condemned the Ethiopian deal, and some in Somaliland have expressed concerns about sovereignty. Kelly, what does this mean for diplomacy in the Horn of Africa, one of the most volatile regions in terms of civil conflict and civil strife and things like that? Could it have spillover effects?
Well, there's a lot to unpack here on this one, Freddie. So each actor has their own very different motivations. But I think let's start with a little bit of background on this one because it is sort of a convoluted topic. You mentioned Somaliland and that it gained independence in 1991. It is a self governing, unrecognized state that is in northeastern Somalia, and it broke away when the Somali Civil War started. And, folks will remember the horrors of the 1990s in Somalia, the Black Hawk Down sort of thing. Somaliland is a democratic government, and it maintains unofficial ties with many of its neighboring states, but no one at this point has extended official diplomatic recognition, partly out of fear of further destabilizing Somalia, which is still going through a lot of issues even today. And as you can imagine, Somalia's government has rejected Somaliland's independence because they still see it as part of Somalia and has made certain threats in recent years as Somaliland has sort of moved towards more international engagement, like we're seeing today. On the Ethiopian side, Ethiopia has maintained strong unofficial relations with Somaliland even before the current talks and deal that's going on. They even have a consulate in Somaliland's capital, and Somaliland also has a representative in Ethiopia. So that's the background of the situation. And what's happening right now with this deal is that earlier in January, Ethiopia and Somaliland announced that they had signed a memorandum of understanding stating that Somaliland is going to allow Ethiopia, which is landlocked, and that's a key point to keep in mind with all of this. They're going to allow Ethiopia to use its Berbera port and lease a 20-kilometer wide area on its Red Sea coast for a potential naval base. And obviously, as you can imagine, that's a pretty big deal when you're allowing another country to do that, but especially if you aren't recognized by any other countries and Somalia still thinks you're part of Somalia. As part of the deal, Ethiopia would seriously consider granting Somaliland formal diplomatic recognition. That would be the first of any UN member state to do so. And Somaliland would also get a stake in Ethiopia's state owned Ethiopian Airlines. Somalia obviously strongly rejects the deal, still claims Somaliland to be part of its territory. And some other countries, notably Eritrea and Egypt, have also expressed support for Somalia's position against the breakaway region. So each actor has different motivations in this story. And Ethiopia, as you can imagine, as I mentioned, they really want access to the Red Sea, not only for commerce, but also for sort of regional power reasons. And also, this kind of distracts from a lot of negative domestic issues that are going on in Ethiopia and have been for some time now. If you're Somaliland, what do you want? You want formal diplomatic recognition. And if Ethiopia is going to give that to you for a port, that's probably worth doing, at least in their eyes. So the loser at this point is Somalia, who's in a tricky spot as it still doesn't have a strong central government, unclear on what it could actually do and what it would do if this deal goes through. But it does, in ways, further destabilize the Horn of Africa, which is never a good thing. So we're going to have to watch this one very closely moving forward.
So that ends our news roundup for the week. Kelly, what are we turning to for our interview for this week?
We now turn to our conversation with Joanna Lewis on the outcome and implications of the recent COP28 climate summit in Dubai. Joanna is a distinguished associate professor at Georgetown University and director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program at the Walsh School of Foreign Service. At Georgetown, she runs the Clean Energy and Climate Research Group and leads several